Well, I think what they're doing, what I'm gonna, let's give them a strategy before the surgery. Shaw and Tiffany will also be a psychology student at Chalmers. So they'll be to stay and hold one way down three instead of so you I should have mentioned it's very like yeah, even if they can't make it, I want to know but just double check. Give him a call. Let him know that he's invited to everything. So, but some, I suspect we're going to spend a fair amount of time tomorrow sort of deciding on a strategy for sure. Long term, we got to get crazy, but I don't know if we want to rely on experts to do this. They can be sort of consultative. These guys drove me in Tuscaloosa. We'll see how honorable all your colleagues are. They got 1 minute to be back in here in 15 minutes. All right. I keep my promises. I told you I was going to start in 15 minutes, and I'm going to start. If y'all have a seat, let's get back to work here. My plan is to get you guys out of here a little bit early so you can get a bite to eat. But if your colleagues don't come back from break, I don't know. I might not be able to. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, have your attention. So with the standard level of risk, there are no specific observation requirements besides your regular institutional rounds and counts. What's the basis in your, somebody who's a youth services aide, how often are you supposed to make rounds and see every kid that they're safe and alive? Like at 4 o'clock in the morning, how often do you go make rounds? Every 15 for everybody? Every 30 minutes, that's what I thought. Okay. So, in conclusion, okay. So there's no extra observation requirements for somebody who is at a standard level of risk, but always be alert because we know that every single person who's incarcerated in your system has some risk factors for suicide. Okay? Any questions at all about standard risk or comments? Okay. Now remember I said that the level of risk by the assessment determines the level of observation. And for low-risk youth, these are kids who are currently stable but have a history of suicidality and something recently that raises the risk. Either they've had some kind of emotional issue come up, a tough kid that you see crying, a kid that's starting to lose weight and isn't trying to, any kind of suicidal threat, even if it's ambiguous or vague, like, oh, you don't have to worry about me. Well, does that mean I'm going to do really good, or does that mean I'm not going to be alive, so you're not going to have to worry about me? You better ask another question. Okay? And if when in doubt, err on the side of caution. Trust your instincts. If your instincts tell you to be nervous or worried, be nervous or worried. Okay? Now, high risk means that you or somebody believes that this kid currently intends to end their life or is threatening to end their life. Now, I'm going to tell you something. If a kid says, I am going to kill myself, believe them. Believe them. Because if you're wrong a lot in life, right? You don't want to be wrong in the wrong direction on that one.
If you're going to make a mistake, err on the side of life. Err on the side of caution. And yes, we will talk about the M word later on. Manipulating, malingering. We're going to talk about that. A kid who's currently expressing a desire to die has made a recent serious attempt or suicidal gesture or a high-risk self-injurious behavior. And remember, even if you're right that they didn't mean to die, nobody gets locked up for having good judgment. And sometimes people make a gesture that ends their life, and we don't even know if they intended it. And they're just as dead. Bad judgment kills children every day. Bad judgment kills adults. Not a week will go by that you won't read about some member of your community who thought it was a good idea to get behind the wheel of a car when they've had a few pops. Because they've been doing it for a long time and they ain't dead yet. I'm a good driver when I'm drunk. You ever heard that one? I'm a good, no, I can drive. I drive, you see them driving 4 miles an hour. Montgomery Police Department, they got a bib for the drooling when they see the 4 mile an hour people, because that's just an easy arrest right there, right? Oh no, I'm a good driver when I'm drunk. And people say that sometimes for right up until the very minute they die in a car crash. Problem is that they usually end up taking somebody's children with them, right? So bad judgment kills people. Don't outsmart yourself. Oh, I know, he just said that. He says that when he wants something. He says that when he wants attention. This is a true story. When I first got to New York and I took over all the prison mental health units, and I went around to all the wardens of the big prisons, Attica, Greenhaven, Sing Sing Home, and I gave them my home phone number. This was 1984, before cell phones. and I gave the wardens my home number. I said, if y'all get pissed off, do me a favor, call me before you call my boss. Give me a chance to fix it. And I got 4 phone calls from 4 wardens. All it was about the same thing, is that my staff had said to him, this guy's not mentally ill, he's a management problem. So one of the wardens, who became a very close friend of mine, Wayne Strack, he's the strongest human being I ever met. He had muscles on his breath. And he used to be a butcher. If you ever want to, don't get in a fight with somebody that used to be a butcher. I'll tell you, just advice, a little word of advice. So I said, what's the matter, warden? And he said, I got a guy that is eating feces. And I said, well, that happens sometimes. How can I help you? And he said, your guy told me he's not mentally ill, he's a management problem. And Doc, I know expert, but it seemed to me that if you put a turd in your mouth, if that ain't mentally ill, it'll probably do till mentally ill comes along. Right? So I had a meeting with all my unit chiefs, and I said, told them the story. I didn't say who it was. And this one guy, there's always one guy that elects himself as the one who's going to argue with the boss. And it's usually the one with the lowest IQ that they elect to do this. And he decides that he's going to take me on. And he said, but Joel. I said, but what? He said, he wasn't mentally ill. He just was, he was manipulating. I said, oh, you mean like to get something? I said, yeah. Where is he right now? Well, he's in segregation, which means a 5-by-8 cell with no books, no music, no people, no nothing. The officers hate him and he hates the officers. I said, what was he manipulating for? because his life doesn't seem to be all that pleasant. I mean, he didn't get tickets to see Lil Wayne or anything. He's just sitting in a little room, right? So can you guess what this is my employee working for, can you guess what he said to me? I know you can. What was the kid manipulating for? Actually, that's a good answer, but no, that's not what he said. I wish it were you instead of him. I wouldn't have had to hurt him. What do you think he said? This idiot unit chief that worked for me. He said, oh, he's manipulating for attention. And I said to him, my friend, nobody in the entire world, including and especially your children, shares your view of the value of your attention. You think your attention is hot stuff, but nobody else thinks that. And irony of ironies, you don't pay any attention to him anyway. He ain't getting no treatment. Right? So now you think by now the guy's going to back down, but by God, he's going to take on the boss because he's got all his friends there that are rooting for him to get his ass whooped. And he said, but Joel. And I said, but what? He said, well, you know, you can make fun of me all you want, but that's why he's doing it. I said, well, I'll tell you what. You think he's manipulating by putting caca in his mouth, right? He said, yeah. I said, I'll tell you what, you like cars? He said, do I like cars? I said, yeah, do you like cars? He said, why are you asking me that? I said, just answer the question. Do you like cars? He said, yeah, I like cars. I said, do you like BMWs? He said, yeah. I said, I'll tell you what. You put a turd in your mouth right now and I'll give you a goddamn BMW. He said, what do you think I am, stupid? I said, no, I thought you were manipulative, but I was wrong. I mean, it's just, it boggles the mind that somebody is ruining their life to manipulate you. Consider the possibility that this isn't about you. Consider the possibility that this is about our enemy and that this is a reflection of despair, of somebody who's so bad at life that they can't think of anything else to do but to cut themselves or throw crap on the walls or eat it or get in a fight with staff knowing that they're going to lose every single time because there's one of them and there's a lot of you. That maybe, that just maybe that's a reflection of despair and not trying to get over. And that maybe they didn't wake up in the morning and say, how can I ruin your day? Right? And when someone's designated high risk, they require constant observation. And, whoops. Constant observation means constant, and it means observation. That means that you don't take your eyes off of them. And that means that if you got to go use the restroom, somebody else is watching that person till you come back. That's what constant observation means. Yes, sir.
Does your comment about the regular routine or regular school plan apply to constant observation?
Yes. If I'm going to be watching you in a 5x8 cell, standing here watching you, why can't I watch you in a classroom when you're doing something?
So, I guess the idealistic way to put it is that you have a security or staff personnel in the classroom to observe that student. Because in a general setting, you got one teacher who may be in despair themselves with 30 kids, 3 of them missing. She have no idea. How is it possible for her to maintain constant observation?
I think that's a great point, and I think it's something we have to decide when we talk about our strategy for implementing this. that ideally I'd like for the clinicians to take your question into account when they decide how much risk the person's in, and say, this kid's at a level of risk where he's not allowed to leave the classroom except under supervision. But if he's in the classroom, that's okay. And then for some kids, the risk is going to be so high that we're actually going to put an aide in the classroom just to watch. But that would be the most high risk, and that the clinicians would basically make an order. But if you've got to be one-to-one of them in the housing unit, it takes exactly the same number of aides to watch them there as it would in class, right? So, but your point's a good one. I mean, I don't think we should dump this on a teacher who's got 30 people to watch if we don't think that they can do it, and then we say, well, it wasn't my fault, it was the teacher's fault. We don't want to set anybody up. So I appreciate your point. And Tim, we'll talk about that when we strategize about implementation. Thank you for that. Other comments or questions? Neither the high risk nor the constant observation kids are going to get issued razors, trimmers, anything that can easily be used to harm yourself. And if you have to ask, then be careful. Err on the side of caution. We're only asking you to document every 15 minutes, but that if it's constant observation, the observation is not every 15 minutes. The observation is every minute, every second. One of the things we did in, it's premature for you guys right now, but what I might encourage you to consider, and we'll be talking about this, and Mr. Davis and Mr. Kent and everybody, is we had a suicide dorm policy where we put kids that needed to be on constant observation, or adults rather, in a prison. We had a 6, or I think in Attica it was 12-bed dorm. An officer sat in the dorm with 12 people, and they weren't allowed to leave that area. There was a toilet there, so they watched each other. The officer could watch everybody, but meanwhile they had somebody to talk to. They could play cards or something. So there may be more cost-efficient ways to maintain constant observation without doing it one-to-one, where you could do one person could be, if you have them in separate lockdown rooms, you kind of have to have one person per kid. But if you have a room that's multi-person, you can have one person maintain constant observation of more than one. So this may be a work in progress, and we're gonna keep working on it. They get a safety blanket and a safety mattress, but they're going to still get clothes unless the clinician has ordered a smock and it's been approved by Mr. Davis or his designee. And that's going to be a matter of clinical judgment. But remember, if somebody's on constant observation, you're going to see if they try to tear up their clothes and make it into a noose. So it's actually the question of putting the right people on the right level of risk. If you think somebody's that suicidal that they're going to rip their clothes up and make a noose, they shouldn't be on a 15-minute watch. They should be on constant observation, or maybe a 5-minute watch, or maybe a 1-minute watch. And that's one of the reasons why I want to see a suicide prevention committee, because I want feedback from especially the youth services aides on how this is working in real life on the floor of the dormitories for people, so that we don't want a great policy that we can't implement and then we blame it on somebody down the line. Okay? Any comments or questions about any of this? Now, this is still a draft, but it's not going to be a draft for very long. So when you guys get a chance, is there a plan to circulate the draft, like to a representative group of people at different jobs in the institutions for comment? Yeah, I think we'll figure out a way to get some input from different jobs to make sure that the policy is way better than it was, but it's not perfect, and there may be a little more tweaking I guess you can't say tweak anymore because it means methamphetamine, but we may want to make small changes to the policy. You ever watch South Park? They got a guy called Tweak who's all the time going like that. Okay. And we don't want to house people at high or constant observation levels of risk on upper tiers because of jumpers. Oops, okay. The idea here is that you don't punish people for being suicidal. Now, I want to be as honest with you as I can be, and I had a conversation with one member of the staff who was explaining to me that if you don't make it punitive, that kids will say they're suicidal when they're not, to get something. So, and I said to that person, I said, well, so if you make it punitive, your hope is that you'll get fewer BS claims of suicidality. They said, yeah. And I said, well, it's probably true. The problem is you'll also get fewer legitimate admissions of suicidality. So if a kid's feeling suicidal and knows that when you're going to kill yourself, the way this institution helps you is to put you in this horrible place where you're going to die of boredom, right? Then the kid says, I'll take my chances. I don't want that. So that's why we're so adamant about not making suicide responses punitive. It doesn't mean it's supposed to be a reward, though. It's just to keep the person safe. We're going to do what we have to do to keep the person safe. Now, for those kids, there may be some kids who really are making claims of suicidality to get attention. But that's not actually the word. The word would be treatment, right? And that's part of why I feel so strongly that you're understaffed in the mental health professions, is that in order to get some treatment around here, I can't just say I'm sad. You got one psychologist per institution. SAD doesn't get you on the radar screen, right? We don't have any time for SAD. Well, what about really sad? Well, honestly, we don't have time for that either. I mean, our psychologists spend an awful lot of their time responding to crises. We have one per institution, right? Well, if really sad doesn't get it, how about if I say I'm suicidal? Will that get me some treatment? So they say they're suicidal, and they get treatment. And we call them manipulative. But I have a question for you. How can I manipulate you when I'm in control of every piece of your life? When I make the rule about what you have to say to get treatment, how can you be manipulating me? I'm manipulating you. It's like you think you train your dog to come when you call him. Your dog trained you to feed him when he comes. The dog ain't making you dinner unless you got a really good dog. Right? When I was a kid growing up, there was an old rock and roll song called Who's Zooming Who? Right? Well, that's my question to you. Who's manipulating who? When we make a rule that says the only way you can get any treatment around here is to say you're suicidal, and I say I'm suicidal, who manipulated who? And that's why I'm preaching to the choir, because I know a bunch of you told me in the break, we knew we needed more mental health staff 20 years ago. Right? And you do need more mental health staff. I got to say, I'm sorry to be a pain in the neck, but I got to say this over and over and over again, because I keep doing investigations of suicides where somebody thought constant meant every 5 minutes. Or, well, I knew where he was. Constant means constant. And it's always acceptable to watch more closely. So if a kid's on a 15-minute watch, there's nothing saying you're not doing anything that you can't surprise them with an extra visit. Or God forbid, sit and chat with them. Some of the best work that goes on at your facilities is these informal, unplanned conversations between youth services aides and kids. If you ever could go into the community, have any of you ever run into somebody that was a graduate of your institution that you knew when they were there? If you ever do that again and they're doing okay, ask them this question. What helped you to get your life turned around? And it's the most amazing thing. If you ask 100 people who used to be kids in the juvenile system that made it, what turned your life around, you're going to get 100 different answers. Some of them are going to say, well, I ran into this one nurse who, was really nice to me. Or I ran into this chaplain who convinced me that, God loved me. Or I used to sit up at 4 o'clock in the morning. This one aide would just talk to me about stuff. And he reminded me of my grandfather. I really understood him and I listened to him. But what all the stories have in common is that some human being made some kind of human connection to that person. And that they somehow built on that to turn their life around. So when you do these watches, we don't want you waking up kids to make them talk, but to be available to have conversations with them, A, it gives us better information about their level of risk, and B, it's actually got a therapeutic effect. When in doubt, refer. A lot of times, watches seem unnecessary. And the reason they seem unnecessary is because you never know what you prevented. That you may have, just by doing your job and showing up unplanned in staggered watches every 15 minutes, that kid didn't take himself out and would have otherwise. And if you don't care about that, then it'll save your job. Okay, comments, questions? Yes, sir.
Observation part, are you talking about in person or via camera?
Well, I'll tell you that the people who do expert testimony around the country on this, all of us say the same thing is, as of right now, cameras are too easy to beat. The other thing is that when places tell me that they're doing video monitoring, I say, who's doing video monitoring? And they say, oh, in the control room. So I go in the control room and I don't tell them who I am. I just stand there and watch for a couple minutes and nobody's watching the monitor. Or the person who's watching the monitor is also working the doors and documenting things, and they're not looking at so the only way to do video monitoring is to stare at one screen, which doesn't save you any staff. We could be staring at the person and having a conversation with them. Now, some places, I want to be honest with you, some people will argue that if I have a dedicated staff person watching 4 screens, that they can do an adequate job. I would not do that, and I would not recommend it, but some people disagree with me about that. I just, usually when I go into camera rooms, one of the things I do is I have somebody walk around in the room, and there's usually ways to beat the camera. So if you think of like this as a cell, right here, a cell, and it looks like you have a pretty good shot at the camera, and I'm standing over the toilet and sink thing, and it looks like I'm going to the bathroom, and what you see is my back, right? And everything looks fine until I slump down, because you can't see the blood that's rolling on the floor, in a black and white camera. So it's just, I don't trust them myself. Now, there may come a day when the coverage is so good that we figure out we can do that, but I'd much rather have a suicide dorm if I was looking to save money than to try to have somebody look at 4 cameras, personally. Does that answer your question? Any other questions, comments? Okay. Now, interventions, first of all, whenever there's a serious attempt, we want to make sure we have some kind of intervention, because even if it were a cry for help, what do you think is going to happen? if the help doesn't come. If I cry with a pretty serious suicide gesture and the cry doesn't get answered, what's my next step? Right? Well, I got to raise the ante. I got to make a more serious one, right? So it's like when parents ask me for advice about raising kids, which I always find humorous since mine drove me just as crazy as yours drove you. But and they say, well, you know, I don't want to overreact. You know, my son just got arrested for minor in possession of alcohol. But, you know, I drank when I was in high school. I don't want to overreact. And, you know, I tell them, it's your job. God wants you to overreact. Everybody has a job. It's the kid's job to make you overreact, and it's your job to react. And if you don't, he's going to do something worse till you do. Everybody's got, it's like a little play. It's a really bad play, but that's what it is. Everybody's got a role to play. So, I mean, you don't, you know, shoot the kid, but that would probably be overreacting. But, you know, it's okay to get mad at things that are wrong. It's okay to correct your kids. That's what teenagers do to get the rules of life clear to them, as they bump up against the limits. Right? They test limits. The kids in the dorms do it. And guess what? You do it with your supervisor. Right? Whenever you get a new supervisor, the first thing you do is see how far you can get without getting busted, so you know what the rules are. It's normal human behavior. But if you don't react to it, then what you're telling the kid is, that's not a serious enough attempt to get any attention. So now you're manipulating the kid into raising the stakes. This is a really important point, so make sure I'm being clear. Yeah? Any questions or disagreements? Speak up, please. I swear I won't get mad at you. You must have easy access to cut down tools. Do you have Hoffman 911 tools in all the stations? If you don't, Mr. Kent just said supposed to. So if you realize that you don't have one there at your station, please let your supervisor know. Because you're going to need quick access to it so that you can cut down a kid. And these tools are great because they can't be used as weapons. They're very safe. And they can mean the difference. It's really common that we'll see near lethal suicide attempts where another 30 seconds would have meant death or brain damage. So seconds count when there's a suicide attempt. So make sure you know where those... Do you know what I mean by the cut down tool? Does anybody not know? Okay. It's a tool. It kind of looks like a V almost, and it's sort of a round thing. And you sort of hook the rope with it and it cuts it. But the blade is inside of the V, so you can't, like, you couldn't cut somebody else with it. I'm sorry, speak up. Huh? Okay, well, you need them. Hoffman is one brand, but there's now multiple brands of them. But it's a correctional suicide cut down tool. You should have one in every control room of a housing unit. They're not very expensive. And I would do that right away. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Say it one more time. Well, scissors aren't as good. These work 10 times better than scissors. If somebody has a pretty stout ligature, it's going to be hard to cut through it with scissors. And if the scissors are sharp, it's easy to cut you. So even the blunt edge ones, scissors can be taken apart easily and used as weapons. So this is way better than scissors. And what month is it? ACA is not coming up till January. They always have them at the exhibitors, the vendors at ACA, but they're on the internet. They're easy to find. All those correctional equipment companies. But everybody needs to know how to use those and where they're located, and they should be within seconds that you can get your hands on one. immediate communication to obtain medical and custody support. So we don't wait around and say, well, I got to make sure he's really hanging before he could be faking it, because seconds matter. I wish this was funny, but I'll tell you, these are all things that people, if I said we played the category game, the category that is things people say in lawsuits after a suicide. I didn't think I thought he might be faking his hanging to set me up, right? So we got to get quick communication for backup. Only qualified medical personnel are able to pronounce a prisoner dead, and until then, appropriate first aid or resuscitation efforts should continue. Do not say or listen to anybody else who says, hey, he's cold. Forget it. Right? Unless you're a trained medical person, because people who have been cold don't die all the time. Sometimes people who aren't breathing can be brought back to breathing with chest compressions. You have everybody trained in CPR? How many of you have been trained in CPR in the last few months? Anybody? Did they train you to breathe and compress, or just compressions? Both. That may change. There's some disagreement in the medical field now about whether some cardiologists are arguing that you should just do compressions, but you should do what you're trained to do until the training changes. But that may be happening. So if somebody tells you, I was taught to just do compressions, they might be right. Depends on where they got their training. But you guys should have one way of doing it so that you don't stumble over each other. Okay. Comments or questions? Reporting and notification. In the event of I hate the word successful, a completed suicide where somebody died, there's a series of notifications that have to be made. Same thing with a serious attempt. Now, you're going to be torn between, if you get a call from the family, you're going to think the family has a right to know, and you're certainly right. I'm very respectful of the family's right to know what's going on. On the other hand, one of the worst things you can do is give people bad information regarding the death of a loved one. And so if this is relatively soon after it, you may think they're dead because they looked dead to you and they got carted off in an ambulance and they got resuscitated later, and you're on the phone saying, I'm really sorry to tell you your kid's dead. And then they find, this just happened recently in Arizona where a family was notified of a death and the person never died, and the family suing the state for upsetting them. I don't know if they're going to win, but media, same thing. You got to be really careful about giving bad information. There's a reason why the department designates people to talk about public information, and one of the main ones, it's not to cover the department's ass, because this stuff always comes out. If you made a mistake, it's going to come out sooner or later. It's to make sure that the information that you give out is accurate and correct. And you're just looking at this from one perspective. You may not have all the information, right? So you're there for the first interview, and Mr. Smith was supposed to be watching the kid. And you hear say, Mr. Smith, were you watching the kid at 6 o'clock? I said, no, I wasn't. I wasn't. I had gone across to the other thing. Oh, my God, he wasn't being watched. And now you're reporting that. We got a problem with supervision. But what you didn't know is that before Mr. Smith left, he talked to Mr. Kent and said, hey, I got to go across the way. Will you watch Joel for me? And in fact, the kid was being watched. So we want to make sure we don't give anybody, family or media, wrong information. So the best thing to do if you're in a position of authority, let's say you're a facility administrator, the best response early is to say, we are going to investigate this well and quickly, and as soon as we have completed our investigation, we'll let you know what we found. But we don't want to give you bad information, and until we investigate this, we can't, we don't want to give out bad information. Right, Dudley? Fair enough, Tim? Okay. Oh, but come on, it's my son. Please, somebody tell me something. It's going to pull at you. And the answer is, I'm going to make sure that I let the people who are in charge of this know how badly you want to know what's going on. And the minute we know something that we're sure of, we'll try to get back to you. But the last thing we want to do is give you bad information. You have a right to the truth. And we got to know what the truth is before we can share it with you. Okay? And that's why we designate agency spokespeople. Now, whenever there's a death by suicide, or really any death in an institution, because you got kids, so any death is suspicious. Or a success, or a serious attempt, or a lethal attempt, or a serious gesture. There's going to be an investigation and what we call a mortality review if the person died. Now, the immediate investigation, first of all, not everybody does this, but my recommendation is that it should include at least custody, medical, and mental health, as well as the investigative staff, which in your agency is part of the Legal Services Bureau. And the reason for that is we don't know who's got the best information or who has all the information at the beginning of an investigation. But we know that medical issues matter, we know that mental health issues matter, and we know certainly that custody matters. So we want to make sure that the investigation touches all of those important points. Mistakes that are made in the first few hours after an event can ruin an investigation so that it's almost impossible to ever find out what happened. I give you JonBenet Ramsey. Remember that little girl in Colorado that died? And to this day, nobody knows who killed her. Because one investigator decided that it was a good idea to let the father wander through the house unsupervised, searching for the girl. And we don't know whether he killed her and destroyed evidence. We don't know whether he's innocent. Nobody knows. And whatever you hear about it, one thing I can tell you for sure, when you see somebody on TV use the word JonBenet Ramsey, they're about to lie. Because nobody knows. And no one ever will know because of mistakes that were made in the first few minutes. Now, I'll tell you what we did in our institutions, and Dudley, you may want to speak up here and some about how you guys do it. Whenever we had a death that wasn't, very clearly due to predictable medical reasons, somebody had cancer, and you're not going to have that. Very unlikely you'll have that in a juvenile institution. The first thing we did was sequester the staff, is separate the staff that were on duty at the place. And the reason for that is we don't want staff to cook a story. We also don't want anybody to say that staff cooked the story and call them liars. That's one way to help establish the credibility of my own staff. The second thing we do is we get a statement from each of those people about what happened, because as time passes, people's memories fade, or people start to recreate it, and it's not exactly what happened. People get scared, and they think they're going to lose their job or get in trouble, and we need to know what happened. So if you get sequestered, it's not that anybody's jumping to a conclusion that you did something wrong. It's quite the opposite. If you didn't do something wrong, it's the best way that I can defend you is to do a really good investigation about what happened. Okay? So far, so good. Anything you want to add, Jim? Usually, what we like to have, anything that jumps off the page at the investigators, we would like to have within 24 hours changes made if there are, you know, serious emergent risks of somebody else dying the same way. But that's only for obvious things. We don't want to jump to investigative conclusions. But for example, if we know we have a cell that's really unsafe, we're going to not use that cell, and that needs to come immediately from an investigator the minute it becomes clear. Usually within 7 days, we want to have some preliminary review and recommended changes, but the investigation is not complete. This is just, here's what we've learned so far, and we might make some tentative changes in policy or a memo or something like that, but it's not a final or completed investigation. Usually the investigation should be completed within 30 days, except for, I don't know how long it takes you, but most places it's infuriating, but it can take months to get an autopsy and the blood work back. So I don't, how long is that here too? Yeah, that's the hard part, because sometimes you think you know the cause of death, and then when the blood work comes back 6 months later, it turns out that the person was high as a kite, and we didn't know it. We just do that 30-day report. We just don't use the word final until those things are back. And at each stage, the goal of the investigation, the overwhelmingly important goal, is not to punish people for wrongdoing. It is to lower the odds of another death the same way, by the same mistake. It is the worst sin you can have in this, is to have somebody almost die by something, you don't fix it, and then somebody dies of it, of the same thing. Whether it's an infection or suicide or something like that. Now, I don't want to seem harsh, but I was raised to be an honest person, and I try to tell it like it is. More people get fired for lying during investigations than they did for the thing they lied about. And if you don't believe me, I give you William Jefferson Clinton, Richard Milhouse Nixon, I always have to give a Democrat and a Republican because I don't want people to think I'm playing favorites. But it's always, the cover-up is almost always worse than the thing they were trying to cover up. And what I told my staff, and if I were running one of your institutions, what I would tell you is, if you make a mistake, I'll do my very, very best to save your job. But if you lied during an investigation, I will not rest until I fired you. And I'm going to try to get you prosecuted. Lying during an investigation kills people because it prevents us from learning what went wrong this time, then we can't fix it. And you got smart people running your institutions. You got smart, competent investigators doing investigations. If you think you're that much smarter than them, then you might want to try lying. And if you got a really good memory, because they're going to ask you what you said. So if you think that's a good plan, go for it, but we're going to get you. We are going to get you. And if you know that one of your friends is lying about what happened, if you don't want to snitch them off, then pull them aside and slap them until they tell the truth. Because we're going to get them. Again, the goal of this process is to prevent another death. Did you have a question? What did I leave out, Dudley? Anything? Okay. Jim? Tim? Alicia? All right. Okay, let me just, any questions or comments about anything we've talked about so far today? Is this information feeling useful to you so far? Is it making sense? Thank you. Demographics. Well, most of this, what I'm about to tell you, I'm sad to say we don't know very much because it's a moving target. It used to be that older white men were the highest risk group for suicide. But now that all the people doing the research, we're all old white men, so we're going to change the, no, I'm just kidding. Unfortunately, the data is changing rapidly, and as I told you earlier today, I'm very sad to report that suicide deaths among African American teenagers have skyrocketed. Skyrocketed. And it's interesting, nobody's exactly sure why. I mean, some people say, well, it's because there isn't a lot of hope in our inner cities. But I grew up in the 60s, and there was a lot of despair in the inner cities then, and we didn't see this. And I don't know why it is. It may be because in the 60s people thought of social solutions to problems. It may be because gangs. I don't know what it is. But all I know is that the group of people who predominate your institutions are at the very highest risk of suicide. All of them, almost all of them. Gender, same thing. You know, males used to be way higher than females, but in almost every criminal justice indicator, girls' percentage of everything is going up. Girls are getting tougher. They're committing more serious crimes. And girls actually are much higher risk of parasuicidal behaviors, meaning non-lethal ones, cutting. And part of this, it gets back to, I forget who asked the question about tattoos, but the same issue with cutting. Cutting is now kind of a fad among high school students. And it's addictive because, I'll tell you why. When you first cut, it hurts like a sumbitch. But if that's a clinical term. It's medical. If you go to the ER and you say, how does it hurt? And you say, oh, it hurts bad. And then the nurse will say, does it hurt like a sumbitch? And if you say, yeah, they mark it down. So it's right. So, but if you have a cut on yourself and you touch it, it's a little bit numb because you're touching scar tissue. So when you cut yourself, every time you do it, it hurts less. And it also, for reasons we don't fully understand physiologically, seems to release endorphins. So if you talk to a cutter before they cut, what do they tell you how they were feeling? Anxious. If you ask them how they felt after they cut themselves, they felt calm. So it's actually reinforcing. It's an effective anti-anxiety behavior. One of the best ways to help a person stop cutting is to teach them other ways to deal with their anxiety that are less destructive. And if you just try to get them to stop, but you don't deal with their anxiety, then you might not have as much success. And that's part of why when kids cut, and then you'll see in the report, he was trying to get his housing location changed. Right? Does that ever happen? And then you say, well, why? Why was he trying to get his house? Well, because he was sleeping next to somebody that was bulldogging him or that he was scared of sexually taking advantage of him. He got frightened, his anxiety went up, and he wanted his anxiety to go down. Well, yeah, he was trying to manipulate. He's just not very good at it. But he was trying to get himself moved to a less anxiety-producing, less fear-inducing situation, and it worked. He cut himself, that lowered his anxiety, and he got moved. What we should do is keep better track of our kids so that when we put a bulldog next to a victim, it's us, not them, that did it. Culture is an important part of suicide risk assessment. The problem is it's hard to make sense of it. The meaning of suicide is very different in different cultures. And some cultures for example, Catholic, people who grew up in Catholic faith, suicide's a mortal sin. And it used to be that you had low suicide rates because it was like, if you think this is bad, where do you check out hell, right? But as people don't believe in those religious values, the protective value of the religion drops, right? So we got a whole bunch of people with different faiths and different levels of belief in faith. So what I would tell you as you're assessing that is to not think of culture as a general risk factor, but rather as a specific one. What does your culture mean to you? What does your religious beliefs say about suicide? What do you think would happen if you died by your own hand? Now, if the kid believes, well, I'll tell you one thing, I wouldn't be in any more pain, then we know that that's not a protective factor. But if the kid says, oh, I would never do that because you go to purgatory, you know, for a really long time, and then you go to hell, and that's worse than this. So that's the only reason I haven't done it. Well, now I know his religion is a protective factor for him. So think of culture. I don't have time today, but when I do training on treatment and the issue of culture comes up, it really needs days to talk about culture. How many of you have ever been through a cultural competence training? Okay. It's real popular up north in usually what will happen, and I'll tell you a story. I got a phone. I used to run a bunch of psychiatric hospitals, and on Friday night I always worked late, and the patients all knew I worked late on Friday night. So if they wanted to call me, they could skip the whole chain of command and the facility director, and I would answer the phone. They'd just call from the payphone. So one night I get a call from a patient that I'd known for a long time. He said, hey, Dvoskin. I said, yeah, what's up? He said, you better get your ass down here. I said, why? He said, they took all the Puerto Ricans off of medication. I said, what? I said, don't lie. And this guy never lied to me. I said, well, you never lied to me in your life, and you're making up a story like that. He said, have I ever lied to you? I said, no. He said, get your ass down here. So Monday morning, I drove down to the hospital. It was about 3 hours away. I drove down there, and I met with the clinical director. I said, have there ever been any changes in the hospital since the last time I was here? He said, no. Why? I said, well, have you done anything different, like with culture? He said, oh, yeah, we had a cultural competence training for 3 days on Hispanic culture. I said, what did you learn? He said, well, I learned about a religion called Santeria, which has a lot of magic in it, and so that some of the behaviors of people that were Latino that we thought were psychotic actually were part of their culture, right? It'd be equivalent of like if you believe in voodoo if you're from Jamaica. And I said, okay. And then what? He said, so we took a new look at people through this culturally informed lens. So I said, now one of the patients that I knew who was very, very psychotic, I'd known this guy for a long time. So I said, I'll make up a name. I said, well, was Jose one of the guys you looked at? And he said, oh, yeah, we looked at him. I said, what changes did you make? Well, we took him off of medication. I said, why don't you call Jose up here to join us? So Jose came up. He said, oh, Dr. Dvoskin, it's good to see you, my old friend. And I said, Jose, how you doing? He said, I'm doing fine. And I said, do you still believe? And then I talked about his specific, he had these delusions that were years and years. And I said, you still believe? So he said, I do. It's the truth. I said, well, have you ever talked to your priest about that? He said, oh, we talk about it all the time. I said, what does he say? He thinks I'm crazy. Right? Sometimes you can be a little too culturally competent. My feeling about culture is, and this is just me talking, not the department's position, but I'm not even competent in my own culture. I don't believe it's possible in a day or 2 days of training for me to be competent in somebody else's culture. What I asked my staff to do was to be respectful of cultural differences, and if they had a question, to ask. To me, if we would all do that, America would be a much nicer place to live. is just be respectful and inquisitive about other cultures. If you want to know the cultural meaning of something, you can ask the person if you ask respectfully. So I had a staff who were from India. And in one part of India, it's considered rude to look somebody in the eye when you're talking to them. If you respect them, you're supposed to cast your eyes down. Right? Well, if you say to that person, look at me when I'm talking to you. And you say, disrespect me. Right? Well, you wouldn't know that. You can't, there's no book that has every culture in the whole world in it. You ask, I notice you're not looking at me when I talk to you. Are you angry with me? Oh, no, it's because I respect you. In my culture, if you look somebody in the eye, it's considered challenging them, and I wouldn't do that to you. You're my boss. I said, okay, good. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding you. Right? So if you have a question, you ask it. And with kids and suicide prevention, it's really important to do the same thing. To say, what do you believe would happen if you were to kill yourself? You know, well, I'd be with my grandmother, who's the only person that ever loved me. And ever since she died, nobody cares about me. Well, that's a risk factor. Or, well, if I committed suicide, it would disappoint my dead grandmother because she's looking over me from heaven and she'd know that's the wrong thing to do. That's a protective factor. There's no book that's going to tell you that, but there's an expert in that child's culture sitting right there in front of you if you just ask them. Right? And that's my word about culture, is be respectful and inquisitive. And I'm happy to entertain other points of view about that because it's an important question. Anybody have anything they'd like to say? Sure. Okay. And it may be less important as a risk assessment in a correctional atmosphere because we've got this artificial culture of the institution that may in fact overwhelm the kids' cultural values. So for example, if you were raised to ask for help when you need it, that's one of the first things you unlearn in corrections, is you mind your business and you don't ever go at, if that's being a snitch, that's like a really bad thing to do. Now, mental illness and mental status, of course, the 300-pound elephant of suicide assessment is depression. Depression has a very high correlation to suicidality, and you have high levels of it in the institution. In fact, you have such high levels that you take depression as normal. If you walk around the facility or you walk around a school in Montgomery and count the percentage of people that are smiling, it'll be lower at Mount Meigs than it will be at a high school. And that's because these are folks that have challenges in their life. Their life is hard. Some of them don't want to be there. And the ones that are even sadder are the ones that do want to be there because it's safer than home. So they have a lot of reasons to be sad. So it's harder to pick out depression when you've got a whole lot of sadness around you. Anger is related to suicide. Anger at you and anger at myself. You can lock me up, you can tie me up, you can control me, but by God, you can't make me stay alive. Right? They call it the last great act of defiance. And you may think you can keep me alive, but you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're not diligent enough, and sooner or later, you're going to let your guard down and I'm going to take myself out. That's why we don't want to be at war with kids. Fear. Sometimes people believe that death is going to hurt less than the fear I'm living with right now. And the worst part of that is when I look back at the history of juvenile corrections, the most shameful part of it is rape. You know, that that I think we do better at it now. I don't know if we do good enough at it, but it used to be pretty common, if you talk to people that were in the juvenile justice system 20 years ago, that they had experiences of sexual violence. And I think it's something we still have to get better at. There's an awful lot of kids in those dormitories, and there ain't very many of you watching them. Isolation, disconnectedness. Every one of you, I know you don't think this way, but every one of you woke up this morning and made a decision to not kill yourself. Right? You just live another day, and we take it for granted, right? But why? It's not like you've never had a bad day. Why didn't you do something stupid when you were depressed or when you had a bad day? Well, if you look in your heart, for most of us, the reason is other people in our life, right? I couldn't do that to my kids, or I couldn't do that to, you know, my church, or I couldn't do it to my wife or my husband or my friends. Having people in your life is a protective factor against suicide, and the more alone you feel in the world, the less reason you have to not kill yourself. And so that's one of the things we want to be aware of, is when kids feel disconnected to anybody else in the world. And remember, every one of them just got forcibly disconnected from their friends, from their community, and from their family. And for a lot of them, the quality of friends they have, these aren't people who are going to bend heaven and earth to go visit them at Mount Meigs. It's like, oh yeah, I remember him. Whatever happened to that guy? You know, we live in this Facebook culture where you know, people are, I get by the way, I don't know if any of you are experts in Facebook, but will something bad happen to me if I don't say okay when somebody wants to friend me? I don't even know what that means. Like, you know, thumb up or thumb down, or like, I get